good afternoon, good evening. I hope you're all doing well. This is Jen, the Liberty Lion, and today I want to talk about more in-depth explaining, at least for this section of this title, what it's talking about when it's talking about its federal citizens and its federal people, and that a lot of people read the federal laws, the federal codes, and in one way or another, they're trying to see where they are in the code. So they've decided that they are this thing, or they are that thing, or they are an individual, or they are an entity, a citizen of the United States, a United States citizen, an alien, a non-resident alien. And what I'm here to help you understand is that as far as the federal government goes, none of those things define you unless you're in the military, married to someone in the military, or you're a civilian who works on a federal military post or some sort of federal land. Okay, so if you start thinking about all these federal things are in some way or another a description of or a law for someone who either lives or works or is married to on someone who is on federal lands, then everything as far as what the federal government does becomes a lot more clear. I've been showing you all kinds of proof that should by now prove to you in your own mind, if you've been listening to me on my channel, that the federal government has only authority and power on federal lands and over the federal people on those lands. In some cases, they share lawmaking authority with the state, and in some cases, they don't. It just depends on whether or not the state reserved their rights over the federal lands, or whether they did not reserve their rights over the federal lands, or whether they reserved some rights over the federal lands. I spoke about that in one of my very recent videos, which you can go back and watch, and I think it was called A Federal Judge Agrees with Me. And then I read to you the GSA manual that explains what power government has and how that power, or the extent of that power, is dependent on whether or not the state allowed them to have the power, and how they went about acquiring the lands that they have claimed power over. The Constitution allows the federal government to have exclusive power over certain lands, but only for military purposes, and that is also in the laws. The problem is when people read these laws, they're not fully understanding them. As a civilian off federal lands, not a part of the federal government, not an employee or a military person of the federal government, you are not under constitutional law. You are only under contractual law. So I believe that the Organic Act of 1871 or 1872 was to provide for a civil government. I believe that. And what that means is that it created another government outside the Constitution, not bound by the Constitution, to which it provides for a government for people off federal lands. Because I believe it's because, as some other people have stated, some other very well-known libertarian type conservative freedom people have stated, some people off federal lands wanted a federal government to legislate for them. The Constitution did not give the Constitutional Congress the right to legislate off federal lands. So when people started begging for a federal government, the federal government decided to go ahead and give that to them, but by contract. And this is where all the forms come in. This is where your signature comes in. This is the difference between the positively enacted laws and the laws that are not positively enacted unless you sign one of their forms. Once you sign a form with the federal government, what you have done is you've put your positive mark on it and you've made it a law. contract law states that the law is in the contract and the contract becomes the law, and it becomes the law for the people who choose to sign it. There are different types of contracts. So some people will say there has to be a meeting of the mind. That is not true for all types of contracts. It's windy outside, so she's barking. So here we're going to look at Title V. Title V is government, organization, and employees. And when it talks about employees, it's talking about the civilians who work with the federal government, in some cases off federal lands, in most cases on federal lands. Section 1, a United States citizen who is a family member of a federal civilian employee of a non-appropriated fund employee. Okay, so let's look at this real quick. There's a difference between a United States citizen, a federal civilian, a non-appropriated fund employee, or a member of a uniformed service who meets the qualifications. So there's a difference here. United States citizen is one person, a federal civilian employee. So that is not a citizen of the United States according to the Constitution, because civilians are not federal. They're federal employees, so they're civil servants, but they're not federal civilians or federal citizens. Federal citizens are in the Constitution called capital C, citizen of the United States. Okay, of a non-appropriated fund employee. What is a non-appropriated fund employee? So the federal government in the Constitution was not given the right to build anything it wanted. It could only build necessary buildings, and it could do the things listed in the Constitution. Those things are like provide copyrights. So if an officer on federal lands has an invention, he has a right to the profits from that invention for a number of years. Just as if you're off federal lands and you're working for a private corporation and you invent something, you're maybe given the right to that invention for a certain number of years, and then after that you're not. You lose it because you were employed by someone and they have a right also. So it's exactly the same thing. So what the federal government was saying in the Constitution is that those people on the federal lands who invent things, that the federal government will guarantee them a right to their inventions, a right to their discoveries and inventions for a period of time to profit from it. The federal Constitution, again, does not apply off federal lands. So all of these people going to the Copyright and Patent Office to have their inventions and discoveries patented are doing so outside of the Constitution, okay? Because they're not military people and they're not civil servants working for the federal government, because the Constitution only applies to those people on the federal lands. The impost, the excise, all these things are part of the property going on and off the federal lands, okay? So what is a non-appropriated fund or non-appropriated instrumentality? So the federal people on the federal lands, the federal government, needed to provide some things to the people on the federal lands that are not in the Constitution. So they couldn't do so by way of the Constitution. There was no constitutional right to do those things. So what they had to do was create sort of an organization where the members of the military or the civil servants could participate in like an organization. I forget what they're called, but it's sort of like a company where all the employees own it. So all the money that they spend on this or in this corporation goes back to the corporation or the organization, I should say. So the Constitution doesn't allow for child care centers to be built on post, not using federal money. The Constitution allows for public money, the tax money, to be used to do those things specifically in the Constitution and necessary or needful buildings. Child care centers are not considered needful buildings or a needful function, but it's something that along the way the military has decided that they should try to provide. So they do so outside the Constitution on a strictly voluntary basis for those people on the federal land. So they volunteer to participate in this organization. The money they spend in this organization goes back to the organization. So there's no congressional money that's supposed to be given to these organizations, because that would be misuse of the powers given to them in the Constitution. Okay, so these non-appropriated instruments on military posts, such as child care centers, are outside the Constitution, and because they're outside the Constitution, the Constitutional Congress cannot appropriate funds for that organization, for that thing. So when someone takes their child to the child care center and they pay the money to that child care center to watch their child, they're doing so out of their own pocket and of their own free will. They're voluntarily participating in this organization, this non-appropriated, non-constitutional organization, using non-appropriated funds. So it's therefore called a non-appropriated instrument or a non-appropriated fund employee, because these people, these non-appropriated fund employees, do not work for the federal government. They don't receive money appropriated by Congress in the congressional bills passed according to the Constitution. And therefore, these are non-positive, under non-positive titles. Okay? Nothing concerning a non-appropriated fund instrumentality or a non-appropriated fund employee can come from money gained through the Constitution or from taxes or from the congressional budget. Okay? None of this can come from there. So it's not appropriated. They don't get money that's been appropriated through Congress. They have to generate their own funds on a voluntary basis through an organization, and that is how they continue supporting themselves. And as such, they hire civilians that come from off the federal lands to work on the federal lands within these non-appropriated fund instruments to help provide for a service to the military and the civil servants on the federal lands. Now, I know this because I had a child who went in one of these places and was, I paid for the daycare center. So it's not something that is provided for the military through congressional funds. Each person pays their fee, their child care center amount for their child or children, and that it just keeps rolling over into this organization, this nonprofit organization. So these non-appropriated fund employees are the ones that are paid through the non-appropriated funds gained through non-appropriated instrumentalities. So this is probably going to be a little bit difficult to understand, but maybe if you listen to this a few times, you'll start to understand. Okay, so I'll say it one more time to be clear. Anything in the constitutional, which the government, the federal government, the Congress has a right to pay for, comes from appropriated funds, meaning they are constitutional money that's allowed to be paid to these instruments or these to military pay or civilian pay. And when I say civilian, I mean civil servants, not non-appropriated fund employees. So You have appropriated funds, which are constitutional. Then you have non-appropriated funds, which are outside the Constitution. These things outside the Constitution are non-appropriated because the Constitution doesn't give them the right to go through Congress to get money for these organizations, these nonprofit organizations. So as a result, they hire not civil servants, they hire civilians, but these civilians work on post with these organizations that do not get money appropriated constitutionally through Congress. Okay, so it's two different systems. You have one that's constitutional and you have one that's not. Non-appropriated is unconstitutional or non-constitutional, meaning those people on the military post participate in it voluntarily and they use their own money to participate in it. The money doesn't come from taxpayer money, and it doesn't come from the public coffer or from Congress. Okay, so of these people are, a lot of times they are the husband or wife, usually the wife of a military member who needs a job. And jobs are provided for first the people who live on post, their spouses. So if you're a man and you're in the military and you work on post in the military and you have a wife and your wife needs a job, the government will try to help her get a job first. If there's no one that can fill that position because they don't have the experience or the education, then they look outside of those people. But because the military members don't really have a say-so in where they go, they try to help them out by providing first their spouses a job when there is a job opening that meets their qualifications, at least to some extent. They don't have to perfectly qualify for the position. And I think, if I remember correctly, that's what this section is about. It's about helping the spouses of military members obtain gainful employment on the federal lands, because everything in the positive law are all about the Constitution, are all constitutional. Things outside non-positive titles not made law, are voluntary. Okay, so the non-appropriated fund employees usually can also be a person, like, let's say there's a military post in the Philippines, and there's no one on the military post that qualifies for the job of, like, usually these are jobs in like the child care centers or the hotels. And in the hotel, they clean the rooms and they do the laundry. And these are just jobs that they have a lot of them, but not a lot of people want them. But the people in the Philippines, usually the women, they want them. So they'll come from off post to work on post, but they're not civil servants. They're non-appropriated fund employees because they work for an organization that is voluntary and outside the Constitution. So a civil servant is an appropriated fund employee, but a civilian. A civil servant is someone who has a position that aids in bringing forth the constitutional mandates and the military missions. Okay, so having a hotel or a child care center is not usually part of a military mission. But maybe doing inspections on post may be part of a military mission. And so they have congressional appropriated employment for people who qualify for those positions when they are appropriated through Congress and are considered constitutional employment. So you have a civil servant. So a civil servant could be someone like the Attorney General, or for me, example, I worked on the military post as a regulatory enforcement specialist. So I understood these things more than the average person because I had to go everywhere around post and inspect these places. And I had to always be reading the Constitution, reading the regulations, knowing how to apply them, knowing where I was and whether or not a state had jurisdiction over the federal lands. And if they did, what type of jurisdiction they had. And that takes us back to the GSA manual on the land inventories and what legislative jurisdiction they had over each portion of land, because they don't have authority over every single portion of land that they quote unquote control or that they have in a state. Okay, so of a member or of a uniformed service and who meets the qualifications and other requirements established by the Director of the Office of Personnel Management. The Director of the Office of Personnel Management are the people who keep track of civilians working on military posts and whether or not they're appropriated or non-appropriated fund employees, including an appropriate period of satisfactory service under one or more overseas appointments and the accepted or competitive civil service. Okay, so accepted or competitive civil service. So I'm not sure what they mean by accepted, but I know what competitive civil service is, and I'm thinking they're probably basically the same thing. So this goes back to the civil servants, civilians who are Americans who work on the military post as part of the appropriated fund employment on federal lands, meaning they help the military achieve their mission, and so their pay and their position is delegated through Congress. Okay, so it's appropriated, it's considered constitutional. If you heard me read the GSA manual, you probably understand by now that the federal government is quite confused over what lands it owns and what it doesn't own and what's actually constitutional and what's not. So when it says that the Constitution allows for them to do this, that, or the other, it may not exactly be the case. So competitive civil service, you can go to a website called USAJOBS.gov and you can look through there and start to try to understand what competitive civil service is. These are civilians who want to work on post in a permanent position and receive pay and benefits from the federal government as civil servants do. This is not non-appropriated fund employees. These are appropriated fund employees, but they're also known as competitive civil service because you have to compete for the job. Other people are going to apply for the job and you have to compete with them for it. So they may be appointed non-competitively to a competitive service position in the exclusive branch within the United States. So as a veteran, I was given points. And so that put me above a lot of other people who would apply for a competitive position. So what this is saying is that there are some instances or some people who may not have to compete with other people for the position. They can be placed into the position. So a United States citizen who's a family member of a federal civilian employee, of a non-appropriated fund employee, or of a member of a uniformed service. So it's saying that some people, when they're in the military and they're stationed overseas, they don't have any say-so in where they get stationed. Mostly. Sometimes you have a choice between 1, 2, or 3 places, and they're all going to be probably shitty, and so you're just going to pick the best one. Well, their spouses should be given priority for any job openings because they didn't have a say-so in going there. And because they didn't have a say-so in going there, they're given a priority into positions that are open. The employing agency in the United States may waive a requirement for a written test for an individual appointed under this order if the agency determines that the duties and responsibilities of the position occurred overseas were similar enough to those of the position to which the individual is being appointed under this order to make the written test unnecessary. So written test doesn't necessarily mean that someone has to sit down and take a test. But what they're saying is that if they're going to put someone in a position which they don't necessarily have all the qualifications for, they can have them take a test for it, or they can waive the test. They can waive the test if they feel like the person's prior position is similar enough that they don't have to require them to take that test. Okay? So this brings me to filing taxes as a United States citizen, not necessarily an American or an American citizen or a citizen of the state, but a United States citizen who's in a different status than just a state person or American. And that these people, when they file their taxes and they claim to be married filing jointly, their spouse may be a non-resident alien, but that status seems to be attached to whether or not they are with someone or married to someone who's a citizen of the United States or a United States citizen. So again, we go back to the people, like, for example, someone in the military. Let's say you're a man and you're in the military and you go overseas and you're in the Philippines and you get married, and you're married to a woman who's in the Philippines, and that woman doesn't want to move on post. She wants to live off post with her parents because maybe her parents are old and she wants to take care of them. She may be, because she's married to a member of the military, she's considered a citizen of the United States or a United States citizen. But for purposes of filing taxes, she may be a non-resident alien because she's not on the federal lands. She's not receiving money for work, but she's married to someone on the federal lands, and so her marriage qualifies her as being a non-resident alien and qualifies him to be able to still claim her on his taxes, but claiming her as a non-resident alien, because status seems to have a lot to do with how they look at you, right? Your status. Okay, so this is Title 5, Part 3, Subpart B, Chapter 33, Subchapter 1, Subsection 3301, Section 1. You can go through and read this and read it as many times as you want. This is under government organization and employees. It is a positive law, so it's been passed into positive law. They consider it constitutional, so it complies with the constitutional dictates. And it's good law, and it applies to the federal people and the people on the federal lands, and it applies to some civilians in their work capacity on the federal lands, and it applies to dependents who may be trying to get work on federal lands, who don't have a choice in where the federal government sent their spouse, and so they're this entire section is telling the federal government how they can put people in positions that they need to be filled when the person qualifies or nearly qualifies for the position that's open, and they designate they specify the difference between non-appropriated fund employee and appropriated fund employee. I know all about this stuff because I not only had to inspect the appropriated areas of the federal government, but also the non-appropriated areas of the federal government as the safety specialist at a couple different places. In one place, the state did not retain jurisdiction over the federal lands, so there were no state laws that applied on the military post. And in another location, the state retained all its rights over the federal lands, and so all the state laws applied on the reservation, on the military post. Okay, so I've got experience working with both where the state retained jurisdiction and where the state did not retain jurisdiction, as well as the non-appropriated areas of the federal government, as well as the appropriated areas of the federal government. Okay, so I kind of know what I'm talking about here. Not only was I in the military, but I was also a civil servant. And a lot of my friends were non-appropriated fund employees. I'm not going to sit here and say that I understand every single little bit of it. I think that would be impossible, but I am telling you what I believe I know to be true. Okay, so there you have some information on appropriated fund, non-appropriated fund, federal, civil servants, military, etc., and what some of this stuff means and what the non-resident alien means. If you still have a problem understanding, that's okay. It took me years to realize what all this meant, and it was years of working in the military and as a civil servant and inspecting these areas and going through the rules and the regulations. So it's not a big deal if you don't understand, and a big part of that is probably my inability to explain well. But here it is, and this is the start of it. If you have questions or you just are completely lost and you're like, hey, you got to do another one of these videos because I'm not getting it, don't feel bad and just post it in there, because if I'm making these videos and nobody says anything, then I'm thinking, okay, wow, I explained it really well and everybody understands. If I'm not explaining it well, I need to know and I need you to tell me. And my email is up on my YouTube channel. So if you don't want to post a comment and you just want to email me, feel free to do that too. I don't check that email very often, but I do check it occasionally. And if I get an email from you and you say, hey, on that video you made called such and such, I don't understand what you mean by the non-appropriated blah, 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 I will help you understand. Okay. So again, like, share, subscribe as always. Be kind to one another. Look out for one another. I know you will, because you're all great, wonderful human beings. And I will see you guys in the next video.